that are not connected, haven't had a conversation beforehand, that don't, and to be able to kind of establish whether they are in fact going to some other place, or at least there is some, as you say, whether it's another world as such. I think that's an open question, or whether they are kind of, each of these individual brains is interacting with whatever it is, whether it's some kind of intelligence or some other environment, or some kind of shared information input. This is, really would be kind of a really exciting project to do, but I'm not sure anyone's actually doing it.
Do you feel like
at the moment
you're up for the task?
Probably not me personally. I'd like to see it done. You'd need, I think, the kind of people that would be good at that kind of thing are parapsychologists who are very good at isolating confounding variables that most people don't consider, to ensure that we can rule out other explanations. I think a really well-controlled experiment, but it would probably be quite difficult to set up, and the experimental conditions would be quite difficult. How are you going to? Are you just going to hope that they would have a shared experience, or are you going to? How do you structure the experiment? I don't think that's an easy question.
No, it's not.
These things tend to happen just kind of spontaneously.
Yeah.
And then it's like, it's an anecdote, fascinating, and these people are probably being completely truthful. But how do you take it beyond an anecdote?
You have to have somebody paying attention to it prior to it happening, so we can kind of... I have a friend who's working on his PhD, and one of the things he hopes to investigate is there any way to potentially... So there's one hypothesis where they're like dreams, they're like waves of information moving through kind of like time zones. Mm-hmm. So he wants to see if he can set up in different labs all around the world, like sleep studies, and see if there's any correlation between the longitude or like any coordinates on Earth that kind of like there's a shared, even a vibe of a dream or anything like this. They can insert some data. I mean, but those are like, the scale is so enormous. It's like the coordination of this whole thing. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
Is there something that you feel, because through everything that we do, we also grow as a person. Is there anything that you feel that you've learned that you truly like didn't know at all before you started writing the book? Now at the end when you wrote it, it's about to be published.
I probably didn't. Well, I've since I first used DMT, 20 years ago, I've been convinced in myself that there is some kind of intelligence there, that this world we enter is constructed by the hand of some kind of intelligence, and that we are in some way interfacing with some kind of supremely advanced, for want of a better word, alien intelligence. But I think what this book allowed me to do was not to demonstrate that as a fact, and I certainly never claim to be able to make that claim, make that assertion that it is really an alien intelligence. But what I spent a lot of time doing in the book was taking each of these alternative explanations, the hallucination explanation, the dream imagery explanation, all the kind of the standard of tools that are kind of wielded by people who like to explain the DMT state away. And I think it's crystallized for me now just how much of a struggle to explain DMT remains. And beyond that, as people will find if they read the book, it's also kind of helped to solidify the picture in my own mind of how I think it might work. And this comes from ideas that I've been working with for many years now, shifting away from the more naive idea of entering another world, of going to another reality, and focusing more on what's coming in, and that the DMT world is more of a direct fragmented world, in that in this ultimate source of sensory inputs, this intelligent agent in some way is gaining access. You know, this idea of you don't break through into the DMT world, the DMT world breaks through into you, kind of flipping on its head the usual, more naive way of thinking about how DMT works, the idea that DMT allows you to go to another world or to peek through a window even into another world. I think that's completely on its head. I think actually in reality it's DMT is gating access, it's granting access to your brain, to
that other information rushes in, so to speak.
Exactly, there's it's hard to demonstrate that, but there are a number of both scientific studies that would suggest this. So a recent study out of Imperial which showed that that DMT induces this state where the brain is highly susceptible to external perturbations. So it's much more responsive. If you stimulate the brain with some alternate source of sensory inputs or whatever, the brain reacts much more strongly. It's very, very sensitive. It's this very kind of fluid and dynamic and malleable.
So it implies the gates are open.
Right, exactly, and means that the brain is much more. So it goes from being very rigid to being malleable and to being manipulatable. One could even say.
It's not true with LSD as well.
Yes,
it makes it like super hyper connected. Yeah.
Right. So with all the psychedelics, you see this to a certain extent, which raises the question of what's special about DMT. And but DMT, I think, seems to be unique still in some ways. Why? Why does DMT so reliably induce entity encounter? Is it just the degree to which this neural state and the efficiency and intensity, the level to which this neural state is being reached with DMT? Or is there something peculiar about the patterns of emergent neural activity that are generated in the presence of DMT? I'm not sure, but I think that that picture of information coming into the brain when the brain is kind of vulnerable in a way to being commandeered. I mean, you can imagine it. It's like this intelligent agent is commandeering temporarily your brain's world-building apparatus, and using your brain. Your brain becomes like the stage. You're not gate crashing the party, you're hosting it, basically. And there's a sense in many of the DMT experiences of a kind of a performance. It's a party, and they're kind of showing off. They're showing you what they can do, and they're controlling everything. They're controlling the visions quite clearly. And sometimes they will show you screens and things, and with viral things going on. And it feels like, if they're controlling the experience, in my mind, that means they're controlling your neural activity. Because it's your neural activity which represents the structure and dynamics of the experience. And there are indigenous peoples that kind of understand this implicitly. So there's a tribe called the Piro, I think they're called, in the Peruvian Amazon, who have communicate with these beings they call Kayiglu, which means the ones who cause visions to be seen. So they understand these beings don't have in their mind a kind of a true visual form, and they are unable to see their true original visual form or their true form in any kind of way. But these beings, they cause their visions to be seen. Now, they don't understand the neuroscience. In my mind, when for an entity to cause the visions to be seen means an entity that is manipulating your neural machinery and is manipulating the visions and manipulating how your brain constructs the world.
It's like they're gaining access to a private server and they get to play on top
Exactly.
of it.
Exactly.
Huh. I heard Bernardo Castro mentioning this a few times, that there was some research, actually I think he said in every research that was done on these things, that it shows that actually psychedelics reduce the activity in the brain. Is that correct? So that kind of goes against what I'm hearing from what came from Imperial with LSD, that it seems to be like hyper-connected. Like, so it seems to be more active. Is that Is there, obviously there's nuance to this, but
There's nuance, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so what he's referring to here is the very first psilocybin study, which was done by the Imperial team, fMRI study. I mean, first of all, lower brain activity, a neuron that's switched off contains as much information as a neuron that's switched on. You know, it's like a 1 and a 0. So the fact that certain parts of the brain are becoming more quiet doesn't imply reduced consciousness or anything like, or reduced information or anything like that, or doesn't force you to invoke something beyond the brain going on. So that's the first important point. The second is that when they did subsequent studies with LSD, they found activation. And I think there was some discussion about that first psilocybin paper, and about perhaps how the data had been acquired or interpreted, and that perhaps with this later LSD study they kind of ironed out those problems. And so we know that psychedelics, they bind to this 5-HT2A receptor, which is an excitatory receptor, which means it makes the neuron more excitable, more likely to fire. It's stimulating. So you would expect to see stimulation, not necessarily globally, but you'd expect to see overall higher activity, more areas of the brain lighting up and indeed speaking to each other. So whereas you go from this very tightly orchestrated, coordinated brain activity where some parts of the cortex light up together and then they quiet and then other areas light up, and it's kind of this shifting from state to state in a very tightly orchestrated and controlled manner. And you go to a state in the psychedelic state which is much more fluid and dynamic, and that's a breakdown of the normal kind of rigid networks of the brain, and parts of the brain start speaking to each other that weren't normally speaking to each other.
that's the case with DMT as well.
And that's the case with DMT, but what you see with DMT, which is kind of interesting, is, well, there's a number of things that are kind of interesting. But in terms of the neural activity, as I see it, a lot of the psychedelic experience more generally can be mapped to this change in neural activity. The world becomes more fluid and novel and less stable in the psychedelic state. And so you go from a state of order to a more disordered state. Carhart Harris calls this an entropic state, the entropic brain theory, as he calls it. So you're moving from order to something closer toward, not into the chaotic realm, but into this subcritical state that's more disordered than the normal waking state. But what happens with DMT, which I think is more difficult to explain, is not the initial shift towards disorder, but then this collapse into what is quite obviously a highly ordered alternate reality. It's not simply a more disordered or fluid or dynamic version of the normal waking world that you might expect to see on a low dose of another psychedelic, but it is a clean transition to an alternate world that is often more ordered in many ways than our world, but just as coherent, just as meaningful, but completely different, with no relationship whatsoever to the normal waking world. And so I'd like to see more studies looking at that. There was some Chris Timmerman, who did the DMT study, fMRI DMT study, and the EEG studies as well, he noticed that there was this, what he described as the emergence of order amidst an ocean of chaos. I think he words like that. I forget the words he used, but you get the idea that there was this, in the deepest levels of the DMT state, there seemed to be another order emerging that you could see within the
The Joe Rogan Experience.
One of the things was it really embedded with Christianity after the Spaniards came, 1516 and 1519, 1521, they brought in cattle. And very quickly, Christianity swept through Mesoamerica, specifically in Mexico. And there's a friend of mine who's a PhD called Joe Torre, was in Oaxaca and just found in a church a cross from the 15th century, 1500s, I mean, and soon after the conquistadors and Spanish arrived, and in the center of the cross are psilocybin mushrooms. So Christianity has a long, deep-rooted history with psilocybin mushroom use in Mesoamerica.
Well, there's that ancient depiction of Adam and Eve from.
That's more debatable in my mind. Yeah, but here it is. Thank you. This is from Joe Latorre's work.
Look at that.
That's a basket
with mushrooms.
With 3 mushrooms in the basket, and there is Psilocybe mexicana. And so the mushrooms are phenotypically correct, but there's clearly a mushrooms in a basket. Can the other slide show with a full cross, Joey? I'm not sure.
Did you know Jack Herer?
Yes.
When Jack was alive, before he died, one of the things that he was working on was a book connecting psilocybin mushrooms and Christianity. Mm-hmm. And he had this massive collection of ancient images, paintings, all these different things. A lot of them were these religious depictions of people that were naked dancing under the, it was like a transparent mushroom shape, and they were dancing. It's like something that would indicate that they were under the trance. And they were dancing. Yeah,
this is an example where there's so many different. You could have 100 different potential representations.
Right.
They're not all going to be correct.
But
a few of them are. And this example here,
the one that clearly is.
And in the Mazatec tradition, it's called syncretism, when you have a foreign influence, in this case a religion, coming into an indigenous people, they merge and they still continue their indigenous practices under coming into when you have tradition, it's called syncretism, when you have a foreign influence, in this case a religion, coming into an indigenous people, they merge and they still continue their indigenous practices under the umbrella of protection. In this case, of Christianity. But in the Mazatec tradition, they believe the tears of Christ is where the mushrooms would appear. They believe the mushrooms were the body of Christ, and therefore you'd never boil them. You never, because you'd be hurting the body of Christ, so you'd only eat them raw or dried.
Oh, interesting.
So really interesting. That's an example of syncretism. And the great Maria Sabina was a devout Catholic. And when she did her psilocybin ceremonies, she had the Holy Trinity. So that's another example where under the umbrella, and from a survival point of view, culturally it makes sense. And they adapted, but they found that this sort of merging of indigenous practices and knowledge of psilocybin in Christianity was very compatible. Just was published, I think 2 weeks ago, at New York University and Johns Hopkins. They had 24 clergy from different faiths, Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, and Muslims, and they had them come in and they did high doses of psilocybin. And they had one group that had delayed it, didn't do it for 6 months, and the other group did a high dose of psilocybin. Each of those faiths, the use of psilocybin mushrooms reinforced their belief in their faith. That was really amazing. I think they said 95% said is the most significant experience in the top 5 are the most significant experiences in their life. So I think psilocybin makes nicer people.
No, I would agree with you on that.
I think psilocybin makes nicer people.
No, I would agree with you on that. The image of Adam and Eve, I'm curious to say, what do you think is debatable about that? Can you pull up that fresco? There's an ancient fresco, I believe it's from France, of Adam and Eve, which supposedly is the tree of life, but really looks like some sort of a mushroom plant.
Yes, it's been postulated by R. Gordon Wasson.
I shouldn't say plant.
Yeah.
In front of you especially.
Thank you very much.
That doesn't look like mushrooms?
They do look like mushrooms.
I couldn't imagine it being anything else.
Well, I mean, here's an example that basically artists become authors of field guides in art.
Right.
You know, how much can you tell the public without violating your oath of secrecy? And so symbology. But yes, there's a cap and a stem, and they come up in clusters. That looks like a psilocybin mushroom. Some people say it's Amanita muscaria because of the dots. But those of us who have grown Psilocybe cubensis, when they're very fresh, they have dots on them. They're very ephemeral. They got washed away. So for the dots. But those of us who've grown psilocybin mushroom, some people say it's Amanita muscaria because of the dots. But those of us who have grown Psilocybe cubensis, when they're very fresh, they have dots on them. They're very ephemeral. They got washed away. So yes.
And you would see the dots, obviously, if it's still in the ground.
If it's in the ground, it's very fresh. But psilocybin mushrooms, bruised bluish. And so this is where we could get lost in a debate of interpretation. But all these representations are not false. Some of these representations are extremely strong based on the evidence. And for instance, the psilocybin mushrooms that we found on the pyramids in Egypt, they are clearly psilocybes. Not myself, but other Egyptologists have also published on this.
Find those, Jamie. Those are fascinating.
Yep.
Because I don't think until fairly recently, within the last few decades, it was understood that they were using psilocybin. I think there was some confusion as to what, if anything, like they were drinking. Blue Lotus, I think, was one of them.
The Blue Lotus is a water lily. Where do water lilies grow?
There it is.
The water lilies grow near ponds.
That's so clearly psilocybin.
And this is the goddess Hathor, the goddess of the cow, by the way. The goddess of the cow. And that's a vase. And anyone who's grown oyster mushrooms or psilocybin mushrooms know that you can put the substrate into a vase like that with openings and mushrooms will come out of the holes. And so that natural culture technique of collecting cow patty. So cows go to ponds to drink. The blue lotus grows in ponds. The blue lotus is blue. The psilocybin mushrooms turn blue. The mushrooms are golden in color. Gold and blue colors are sacred in Egyptology. And ancient Egyptian culture. So now Egyptology and blue colors are sacred in Egyptology. and ancient Egyptian culture. So now, I was not the first person to discover this. Actually, I saw this from an article that was published by Azim Abdel, a friend of mine, a mycologist in Egypt, who presented it at a conference. And
How long ago was this?
This is over 2,000 years of age.
No, I mean when they
2016.
when they brought us to the 2016.
2016.
That's kind of crazy, isn't it?
It is. And then Kalindi, the great Kalindi from Detroit, he unfortunately died of COVID, but he also, from his African heritage, also believed that, and he was rediscovering his African heritage, and this is called re-indigenization, rediscovering that which your ancestors practiced, even though the linear transition of knowledge may have been cut. Mm-hmm. But this is taxonomically accurate for growing Psilocybe cubensis, and it grows on cow dung. Cow goes to ponds. If you went to get the water lily, you'd run into this constantly. Now this, and with the Hathor, where this temple is now, they get less than 1 millimeter of rain a year. And the Nile used to be flooding all the time. It was the breadbasket of the world. But they built the dams, and restricted the flooding. And so the climate change. So the modern Egyptologists have no reference. And so when you have climate change, the ecosystem changes, then the scientists of day don't have the familiarity as the experts thousands of years ago.
Right.
So they become rare, they become scarce, and the generational knowledge is lost. But now there's a real big re-indigenization movement in Egypt combining the blue lotus with Psilocybe cubensis.
What is the psychedelic compound in the blue lotus?
That's a debatable thing. There's a really complex chemistry there. I'm not an expert on that, but I've talked to my other friends who are experts. There seems to be an entourage effect of multiple agents. So I can't really speak authoritatively to that, but I have been told that there are several active ingredients, and they think the entourage effect of them together creates this heightened state of awareness. And I think that as an admixture with psilocybin makes a lot of sense.
Are contemporary people taking blue lotus?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Is there like a community of people?
There's a massive community, but because blue lotus now has become scarce because ponds are scarce. So I put out there a reward of $1,000 for anyone who can find, DNA of psilocybin mushrooms in any of the wells or ancient ponds, used to be ponds, in the Egypt area. Because if we can find the DNA in the vase and the substrate, then we can actually prove this theory.
Right.
It's more than a hypothesis, because I've met many Egyptian mycologists now who absolutely believe this is true, not scientifically, but sort of intuitively from their culture. This makes a lot of sense.
It does make a lot of sense. And if you've got it on these hieroglyphs.
And they were known as the flesh of the gods, which is the very same name when translated for Teananacatl from Mesoamerica. The psilocybin mushrooms were known, Psilocybe mexicana, as flesh of the gods. So it's interesting, in both sides of the world, they had the same interpretation. Mushrooms were not allowed back in this time to be picked by commoners. They were only reserved for the royalty.
Oh, boy. Doesn't it always work out that way?
Yeah, it seems to.
Another thing that's really fascinating is depictions of
be picked by commoners. They were only reserved for the royalty.
Oh, boy. Doesn't it always work out that way?
Yeah, it seems to.
Another thing that's really fascinating is depictions of ancient saints and even Jesus Christ with a halo, and that the halo is essentially the bottom of a mushroom. It's a very different halo. When we think about a halo, we think about like a frisbee that's hovering over an angel's head or a saint's head. But the ancient depictions of them weren't that. The ancient depictions of them, you saw those ribs that made it look like the bottom of a psilocybin mushroom.
I didn't know that.
You didn't know that?
No, I
oh,
didn't
come
know
on.
that.
I'm teaching you this?
Yeah.
Come on. Jamie will pull up these images. But these images of Christ, there's many different religious figures, and they have this halo that's very different than the more modern halo. The modern halo being this like circle. This is not a circle. It's a circle, but it's a mushroom. It's essentially they're explaining that these godly, holy people were under the influence of psilocybin. I think
what we can't,
and not just me.
What we can't prove some of these ideas today. What we can prove is like the Johns Hopkins New York University study that religious belief systems are enhanced through the use of psilocybin.
Which totally
It makes sense. So we can argue about the past, but we can't. We have really
Right.
good scientific methodology now for analyzing the effects of psilocybin, and it's profound. It's
Yeah.
profound.
You got any of those images?
It's not. What's coming up really is us talking about it before and a bunch of pictures of mushrooms. So I was trying to find out.
There's some better ones.
I know, but it's not. I didn't
You
get.
can't find them.
I wasn't getting.
Man, the government's pulled them off the internet, man. That's not one.
Yeah.
That's the ones that I've seen are far clearer than that.
I'll just show you there.
Yes, those.
Yeah.
That's the ones I
Like,
put up
look at
before.
that one, which is crazy that you have
Well,
to.
that's
find,
that.
you have to
one
go to
on-
us.
That's.
Yeah, see what I googled.
Like, look at
I
that.
can see the one on the left.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I'm talking about. I mean, that essentially looks exactly like that.
I've never seen that.
That's crazy that you can't find that anymore, and we clearly found it in the past because we talked about it.
Well, that may be the effect of Joe Rogan, right? You could just overwhelm the entire internet with images. So,
I mean, look at the bottom of that one in particular, the one in the center.
Yeah.
I mean, that looks exactly like that halo,
yeah, that's not a.
which totally makes sense. Look at
It
that.
does.
Okay, there's one. Look at that image.
Yeah.
So this is the old school halo. The old school halo clearly looks like the bottom of a
I'm
mushroom.
blown away.
You're blown away.
Hiding in plain sight,
I
right?
can't believe that I'm teaching you this. I can't believe you. How come nobody told you this?
I don't know.
You said you knew Jack. You knew Jack when he was alive. This was like his primary concern towards the end of his life. He was working on a book.
Yeah, I mean, the limitation of life. Unfortunately, we have all these great people who pass when they're at the peak of their knowledge. You know, and that's the other thing that I think psilocybin has really informed me is that Joe Rogan and Paul Stamets are talking. Jamie is there, but we have such a thin slice of reality. And when you're on psilocybin, the unanimity of universal consciousness to be involved in something you realize is so large.
Yeah.
Did you see the galactic images from the Rubin telescope that came out yesterday?
No, I did not.
Millions and millions of new galaxies, literally millions of new galaxies. I think 2,100 new asteroids
Whoa.
in near Earth orbit.
Oh, fun.
Oh, fun. Oops.
Well, there's already 900,000 of them.
Yeah. So but this has just happened.
Wow.
But this is, yeah.
Wonder how many of those
Rubin
people out there are tripping balls.
just got released, the largest telescope in the world, and there are millions of galaxies. Millions of galaxies. And so, from my experience, which I will admit, I came from a Christian background, so my first times on psilocybin mushrooms is very Christ-oriented. And then as I got more and more into the psilocybin experience, I realized that this is just this concept that we live in this great expanse. And I'm assembly of molecules, so are you. We didn't exist before we were born. You know, we will disassemble, decompose, and we'll go back into the cosmic dust. And this is part of the continuum of existence.